get back to that better than expected US jobs print now. We'll break down the numbers with Stifel Nicholas chief economist, Lindsey. Lindsey, great to have you with us. So, looking under the hood, what was your assessment of the numbers that we saw? And should we be as, I guess, exuberant when it comes to interpreting them?
Well, it certainly was some welcomed positive news, suggesting that the U.S. labor market is continuing to head towards a path of recovery. But broadly speaking, while it was a step in the right direction, when we look at the job gains over the past 6 to 8 weeks, it's really done little to offset the over 20 million jobs lost at the height of the economic closure at the start of the second quarter. So it really remains to be seen whether or not we will continue this positive trend of hiring and get to that position of recovery. The latest data, as we've talked about, showing rapid rises in COVID cases around the United States, forcing some states to halt or even reverse their reopening plans. And so these new jobs that we're seeing, or these rehires that we're seeing, could actually turn back into positions of joblessness if we don't see the reopening process continue.
Right. So in terms of the improvement that we see, how much of a threat then is the potential that we see economies in major states and major cities across the U.S. having to shut down? And I suppose how much opacity does that give to any data that we don't know how much of a stop-start process any kind of economic reopening is going to look like over the next, month, 3 months, 6 months from now?
Well, that's a good point, because the data that we're looking at in terms of this morning's report is already stale. This is already 3 weeks old. And what we see looking at other labor market data, including the initial jobless claims, is that we're still seeing a significant portion of the labor market file for unemployment. So we may already be starting to see that second wave of layoffs or furloughs that just hasn't shown up in the monthly figures yet. But what we know at this point is that many areas are now rolling back restrictions. They're putting those back in place. So areas that we thought were going to be able to jumpstart local economies and get people back to work, looking for some a semblance of normal, are now heading in the opposite direction, with bars, restaurants, boutiques, offices once again being closed. And this is certainly complicating the outlook then for the recovery. And again, raising the question of whether or not these earlier job gains will prove temporary if we do see that potential second round of layoffs, with businesses once again being forced to close their doors or operate at extremely repressed levels of capacity.
Given this background, what happens to the overall U.S. economy, given that also at the same time we are going to see that expiration of the federal government's extra $600 in weekly unemployment benefits?
Oh, absolutely. I think at the very least, this complicates the picture. And I think business owners, workers, state and local officials, they're realizing that the economic recovery, at least from an intensity perspective, is going to be much more complicated and much bumpier than previously anticipated. We were still hearing a lot of claims about a potential V-shape in the second half of the year. And from a duration standpoint, the anticipated recovery, I think, is going to be very much delayed at this point. So very tepid growth as expected through the end of the year. As we turn the corner into 2021, we could continue to see very slow, very tepid growth. This is a very slow and painful process, unfortunately.
We continue to hear, though, from policymakers, including Secretary Mnuchin, saying that he's already started talks on another stimulus package. We have had a lot of fiscal, not to mention monetary support. How much of all of that has actually filtered through the real economy?
Oh, I think a lot of it has. We've been talking about unprecedented amounts of policy support, both from the monetary and the fiscal side, so trillions of dollars being pumped into the economy. And, of course, we don't have the counterfactual to argue against, but we do look at the data and we can see that a lot of this money have gone directly into the household balance sheet, the individual balance sheet, and it's actually helped prop up individuals and businesses, particularly small businesses, during this unprecedented period. So really bridging that gap. And if, in fact, we do see a second round of closures or a second round of restrictions, forcing businesses to once again close their doors or operate at a reduced capacity without a second round handout from the government, we could see an even more dire picture from an economic standpoint as we go into the second half of the year. So it certainly is painful to look at the amount of debt and barriers that the economy is going to have to face once we eventually merge from this pandemic. But in the short term, helping businesses and individuals through this very difficult time seems to be the only course of action, with Congress hopefully coming forward with a second round package.
Lindsey, I'm wondering what your view at this point with regard to inflation is going to look like, because Bloomberg Economics has done some studies into, whether in fact, depending on your income bracket, depending on which, I guess, part of the spectrum you're on, that the impact of the pandemic may not actually be as disinflationary as we initially would, I guess, feasibly think that it might be.
Oh, I don't know. I think it was pretty disinflationary at this point, and outright deflationary in some areas of the economy. When you're talking about growth being stalled as we look for a 30% decline in the second quarter, that's going to have significant ripple effects for quite some time from a price standpoint. So this isn't something that we can say is a near-term shock and expect the economy and price pressures to reemerge in the second half of the year. I think this is a lingering impact on consumers and particularly their behaviors going forward. Regardless of where you are on the income spectrum, as you suggested, individuals are changing how they're spending, how they're interacting in the marketplace. And until we have some sort of vaccine or even an honest way to separate the healthy from the sick, we're going to continue to be hesitant to go out into the marketplace and spend and interact like we once did. Now, some categories can be replaced by other categories. So dining out. We're not going out to restaurants as frequently, but we're staying at home. But some areas can't. And so there will be lost revenue, lost income, lost expenditures that won't be recaptured and will continue to put downward pressure on the economy, downward pressure on prices.
Lindsey Piegza, thank you very much for joining us, Stifel Nicolaus Chief Economist.